ES Audio.
From the Evening Standard in London, I'm John Weeks, and this is The Leader. For the first time since 1984, polio has been found to be spreading in the UK. The virus was detected at Beckton Sewage Works in London back in February, then again in April, and again more recently. The samples were found to be genetically similar, so it's thought a family or extended family is involved. As a result, Londoners have been urged to make sure that babies and children are fully vaccinated against polio. It's a rare, disabling and life-threatening disease caused by the poliovirus. Jane Clegg, chief nurse for the NHS in London, said that the majority of Londoners are fully protected against it and won't need to take any further action. But the health service will reach out to parents of children under 5 who aren't up to date with their polio vaccinations. So what does this latest virus outbreak mean for London and the wider country? And should we be worried about community spread? Dr. Mike Skinner, a virology expert from Imperial College London, joins me now. So Mike, first of all, what can you tell us about the poliovirus?
Polio is quite a different virus to COVID-19. Antigenically, it's very stable, and by antigenically I mean the virus's ability to generate variants that can resist antibodies that we've made in response to vaccines. So there are actually 3 types of poliovirus, 1, 2 and 3, but each of those types are very stable. They haven't changed antigenically, so the vaccines have worked against them since they were derived back in the 1950s. And those vaccines have led to virtual eradication of all 3 viruses globally. In the UK, we've had, they were certified eradicated from the UK back in early 2000s. Globally, we just have really a problem with poliovirus type 1. That's the only wild poliovirus that's still present. And actually, it's just a handful of cases. Currently in Afghanistan, it seems to have been eradicated now from Pakistan, where there are also previously some cases left. But of the 2 types of vaccines that use, there's a live polio vaccine, which elder listeners will remember getting on a sugar lump, and then there's a killed vaccine. And it was the sugar lump vaccine, if you like, that actually helped us eradicate the virus from the world, because that actually stops the virus circulating. The killed vaccine is good at protecting you from getting the virus, or rather stopping you have disease from the virus. So the UK, after eradication, went over to just using the killed virus. But we were aware that there were viruses elsewhere in the world, so clinicians have been on the lookout for it, and they set up this program of screening for the presence of the genome of the virus in sewage to give a first indication that whether we had any live poliovirus in the country.
And what do we know about the current polio situation in London?
They detected it for a few months from February. And they've seen some slight genetic change in it. That's not suggesting that it would resist antibody, just that we would normally expect a few changes to occur. And it indicates that the virus is replicating. It's assumed it's probably coming from a country where they are still vaccinating using the live polio vaccine against type 2, because we know that it's a very effective vaccine. A frequency of about 1 in a million vaccinees, it will revert such that it can actually spread. And it generates something called vaccine-derived poliovirus type 2. And we assume that somebody has travelled to one of the regions where they're still using the live vaccine, that they've either been vaccinated abroad or have picked up a vaccine derivative from somebody else. They brought it back into this country and they've been shedding it and possibly infected somebody else. Although we know of cases where people who have got immunosuppression have been infected with a poliovirus and actually have shed it for a surprising number of years. So it could be that there's been a little bit of an ongoing transmission, or it could just be that somebody who's immunosuppressed has picked it up. WHO wouldn't define this as ongoing circulation of the vaccine-derived virus yet. It hasn't met those criteria. But it's meant that the local health authorities have looked at vaccination uptake figures in that part of London, and they're down at about 86%. It's part of a combined vaccine, and they really would like that up at about 95% to stop even the remote possibility that the person who's brought it into the country or one of their contacts might pass it on into the wider community.
So is further community spread likely to happen? And can the virus spread via hosts, for example, who have already been vaccinated against it?
Poliovirus is an enterovirus, and it can spread by the sort of fecal, oral, and even by, not quite respiratory, but through close contact as well. So yes, it can spread, but it's interesting. The authorities detected the genome of this virus in basically a large sewage works, and what they're doing is working their way up the chain, the various chains that feed into that sewage work, so they can actually localise a community, a much smaller community, where the virus might be present. And they can have an enhanced immunisation campaign, I guess, in that area. So the vaccine virus is not the wild-type virus. I don't think it spreads as effectively as the wild virus. So any transmission, one would assume, would be limited. But we're so close to eradication of polio, we really don't want to let the cat out of the bag here, not just in the UK, but generally globally. So WHO is very keen that national authorities get on top of these viruses, because there's strong pressure for the whole globe now to move over to a killed vaccine for poliovirus type 2, which will actually stop the generation of these viruses.
And I understand vaccinations against polio are so important because of how seriously ill it can make people. How does the disease affect those who get it?
We're all aware these days that some viruses, like corona, but also polio, would infect a massive numbers in the population. We had huge spikes in the US and in Europe back in the 50s. And whole populations of young children would be infected. But about 1 in 100 of them would get a more serious disease, and 1 in 10 or so of those would go on to get paralytic poliomyelitis. And that would affect their breathing muscles. So this is where we saw those pictures of the hundreds of iron lungs in some medical facilities, particularly in the US, supporting the breathing of those children who had that, until they recovered some use of their breathing muscles, or in some cases either died or had to remain in those facilities until they got more modern breathing support machines. But some people were left with a long-term paralysis, so-called flaccid paralysis. It's fairly characteristic the way it affects your leg, and old people will remember seeing people walking around, obviously having had polio in childhood. So it's a killer, it's a crippler. It was highly feared amongst parents in the 50s that their children would get this and suffer lifelong consequences.
Let's take a break now. Stay there for part 2 though. Dr. Mike Skinner will tell us how worried we should be about polio, and also discusses some of the environmental concerns about this outbreak.
Ideally, we don't want sewage getting into our waterways.
So Mike, how much should people be worried about this sort of return of polio?
The UKHSA says they pick up 1 to 3 such indications that this virus has come back into the UK. They've been sporadic detections and they haven't seen it anymore. In this case, it's gone on for 2 or 3 months. So they're concerned. As far as we know, they have had no cases reported yet. But the indication is that there might be a small number of cases in the community. We should be concerned enough to respond positively to request invitations to come and get vaccinated if we haven't been vaccinated. The vaccine works effectively. So if you had childhood vaccinations, if your children have had vaccinations in recent years, they will be fine. But if you haven't been vaccinated, or if the authorities are asking you to come along and should they ask for you to come along to do a boost, then I think we should be concerned enough to respond positively to those invitations.
And some people and campaign groups have raised environmental concerns about this. What is the risk of the virus actually spreading through our waterways?
I think it's pretty limited. I mean, we do know that people can pick up enteroviruses from sewage contaminated water. So there are low-level risks, and particularly the amount of this virus in the waterways is in the wastewater is extremely low. I mean, these detection techniques are extremely sensitive, and we're talking about just 1 or 2 people possibly shedding it into the water. I don't think we're even quite at the level where when there's a big outbreak of another mild diarrheal disease in the community and that gets into the waterways and possibly even out onto our beaches, then there is a risk of getting infected. I think that the polio at the moment, the amounts that we're talking about, it's way lower than that. But ideally, we don't want sewage getting into our waterways.
That's all from The Leader. There's more on this story in the Evening Standard newspaper and online at standard.co.uk. Thanks for listening. We're back tomorrow at 4 p.m.